Thank you, Fouché. Thank you to ERSA for giving us this platform. Claudine left, but I managed to give her a hug. So this is a collaboration paper with Junior Mai from the Norges Bank, Utira from the University of Pretoria. I really don't know why my name is in bold. Christian Tipoy from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So what we're talking about is navigating optimal inflation targeting in South Africa, a regime switching DSGE approach. And of course, the usual disclaimer apply. And another disclaimer is you'll direct all the difficult questions to Rutira, not me. That's a joke. So since this morning, we've seen that inflation targeting is a pillar for monetary policy, and especially for countries that are commodity exporters like South Africa. Okay, our inflation dynamics will depend on commodity price volatility. So and we've seen as well, if you listen to Jan this morning, how difficult, challenging it is to estimate the optimal inflation targets. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a dynamic approach. So we're going to estimate a regime switching DSGE model that's going to account for possibility of regime shift in monetary policy, and of course, a shift in commodity price volatility. So the effectiveness, and as I was telling Jan this morning, the effectiveness of inflation targeting will not depend only on the optimal inflation target, which is just a number. It's also going to depend on how the central bank will react to deviation. Okay, and especially their policy preferences. So the South African Reserve Bank should adjust its policy in response to shifting commodity prices and inflation dynamics. This is our major question. The existing model have overlooked, and I'm not putting pressure on Richard, who's going to do some of these models. They've overlooked the changing nature of monetary policy regimes, so it's very difficult to account for real-world activity. So we're going to develop a dynamic framework, DSGE model, for the South African Reserve Bank that we're going to optimize inflation targeting to see basically how the central bank can respond to external shocks. So this is the literature. Let me just keep. Actually, we had 70 slides because last year we had an hour presentation. So we worked for an hour presentation just to find out yesterday we're going to have 25 minutes. We had to cut down everything to 33 slides. So let me skip quickly and then just give you a summary of the literature. So the existing model focusing on inflation targeting, they have focused mostly on non-commodity dependent countries, okay? And whenever they look at commodity dependent country, they overlook the possibility of regime shift. So that's what we're going to look at, and especially you heard again today, there is a very limited literature that look at optimal inflation targets. So that's what we're going to do here. So our contribution is to develop a regime switching DSGE model that is tailored to the South African economy. So we're going to use a regime switching DSGE model. We're going to, after the estimation, introduce a loss function. And that loss function will depend on the central bank preferences over inflation stability, output growth, and interest rate smoothing. We're going to optimize that inflation target, and then we're going to conduct some sensitivity analysis, seeing how the change in preferences can have an impact on optimal inflation target. We're going to also provide you some counterfactual simulation to compare real-world monetary policy with optimized outcomes. So we did all our estimation in RISE, the RISE toolbox of MATLAB. So what are the results? First of all, the optimal inflation will depend on the central bank preferences, okay? And what we've seen is whenever the central bank prefer inflation stability, so if we have a strict inflation targeting, we can afford a lower optimal inflation. But if we have a trade-off between inflation stability and output, then we can afford, or we have to afford, a higher inflation, optimal inflation. And we have seen as well that the optimal monetary policy outperform the historical data. And you see that later on when we're going to look at our counterfactual. Excessive interest rate smoothing will try to hamper monetary policy. Just think a second. I know Hilton said that the South African Reserve Bank doesn't want to hear about them following a Taylor rule. But if we think a second that the monetary policy follows a Taylor rule and we have a strong or a high smoothing parameter, it becomes very difficult to adjust the policy rate, okay? So interest rate smoothing will weaken stabilization, so we need a more flexible approach. So this is the roadmap. I'm going to talk a bit about the regime switching DSGE model, the model parameterization, the result, and then the optimization of the inflation target. Then we're going to look at the counterfactual analysis. So we have a small open economy following the work of Medina and Soto. We have households that are Ricardian and non-Ricardian, and we have two sectors, one that trade commodity and another one that produce non-commodity. And of course, we have monetary policy that affect inflation, output, and real exchange rate through interest rate adjustment. We have accounted for the possibility that we can have a shift in commodity price volatility. So, and then as well, we have a time-varying monetary policy response. So, for example, if monetary policy is conducted using a Taylor rule, the weight on inflation and the weight on the output depends on how the Reserve Bank responds to shift in commodity price volatility. So basically, we're going to have the weight on output and inflation switching between period of low and high volatility. So we had some parameters that were calibrated, and we did the estimation using quarterly South African data from 2000 Q1 to 2019 Q2. We wanted to avoid the period of COVID. 6 observed macro variables. We have the usual one, output, interest rate. We have the real exchange rate, the current account, and then the commodity prices. And the parameters are estimated using the Bayesian technique. So we combine our prior and our likelihood. And the calibration and estimation result will definitely have an impact on our optimal monetary policy rule. So we start first with the maximization of our posterior. So we use the B algorithm, which is better than the default F-min-con. We draw 1 million, we did 1 million simulation draws. We burn the first 200,000, and we keep each 25th draw to reduce serial correlation, and we did 2 chains, okay? So the convergence diagnostic were okay. Yeah, the estimation result. So the table is long. In our 70 slide, we had the whole result. So here we're showing you now only what is happening on the Taylor rule. We found a high smoothing parameter, 0.853, and this is from the posterior simulation. And we can see that there's a strong persistence in policy adjustment. Response to inflation, there is a modest adaptation, and this is from the alpha pi s. This is how the central bank reacts to shift on inflation in terms of the way they put on inflation. The shift on, commodity price volatility, depending on the way they put on inflation on the Taylor rule. So it was modest. But for the outputs, we found a great sensitivity to commodity price volatility. The switch from a period of low volatility to high, okay, we found that the period of low volatility is long-lived compared to the period of high volatility. And this is given by the vol-TP estimate parameter that we have there. Then we computed our state probabilities, and we found that the high volatility state occurred between 2007 and somewhere in 2010, where we had some reduction in volatility, and again a bit of an increase in 2012, and again just before 2015 and 2017, the third quarter. Then what we did was to take our estimated result and use our loss function to optimize the inflation target. So this is the loss function we use. So here, omega y and omega r are the preference of the South African Reserve Bank on output deviation and interest rate smoothing. So what we did was to generate between a range of 0 to 1.2 for the weight on output and 0 to 0.8 for the weight on interest rate to generate 10 equally spaced values, okay? What becomes difficult is that the computer can pick, or the MATLAB can pick any number between these two ranges. But that's what we use. Okay. And it's difficult to do an analytical solution, does not really exist. So what we did was to do some simulation. We simulated some artificial shocks, feed them to our model, and then we were able to find the optimal inflation target by minimizing the loss function. So the optimal inflation target will, of course, depend on the central bank preferences over interest rate, over the interest rate smoothing, the weight on output, and inflation stability. Okay, so the variation of this weight will lead basically to different inflation targets. Here are our first result. I remember the day or the night we got this first result. Utira jumped on his chair when he saw them. We go back to the pi target, the graph on the top left, but let's start first with the smoothing parameter. What we found is that the smoothing parameter tends to increase with the weight put on interest rate. So if the Reserve Bank doesn't want really the interest rate to jump, then of course we're going to get a large smoothing parameter, and it tends to decrease with an increase in weight put on output, okay? This means just that whenever we care about output, the interest rate needs to be flexible so that we pursue this goal of employment creation. And for the weight on inflation, okay, by alpha C there, it tends to decrease with the weight on output, okay? And of course, with the weight that we put on the interest rate smoothing parameters, and even the reaction to the deviation of inflation, of the commodity price volatility, it remains a bit constant whenever the weight put on output increases, and then tends to decrease, and of course, this is exacerbated by the increase also in the interest rate smoothing parameter. For the output, okay, we found that, of course, when the weight put on output increases, then the Reserve Bank reacts more on the output deviation. And we saw as well that the response following the change in volatility of the commodity prices tend to increase with the weight on output. So this is the optimal inflation target, and you've seen that since this morning, no one has given us a number. So we're not gonna give you a number. Why? Because this number depends on the central bank preferences over inflation stability, output, and interest rate smoothing, okay? So if the Reserve Bank becomes strictly inflation targeted, so we focus on inflation, we forget about output, and you should not tell that to Julius Malema, we can entertain a lower optimal inflation target, okay? As we start caring more and more about output gap, we want more job creation, then we can only afford a higher optimal inflation target. So I'm going to tell the South African Reserve Bank, pick your poison, okay? And then you can tell us what will be the optimal inflation target. So this is the key takeaways, what I just told you. Lower output, weight on output will lead to lower inflation targets. And whenever we increase the weight, then we can only afford a higher inflation target. The high interest rate smoothing makes it difficult for the interest rate to move, Okay, so it's going to render monetary policy difficult. The inflation response tends to decrease with the weight on output, and it tends to decrease also with the large weight on output, but the decline is slow whenever the smoothing parameter or the weight on the interest rate changes. But for the output growth, we saw that for both parameters, there is an increase with the central bank preference on output. So we've done some counterfactual. Okay, so we look at the impulse response function. What will be the response of the macroeconomic variables following a shock? Okay, and then we look at first our optimized rules, and we pick two optimized rules. The first one, when the central bank does not care about employment, does not care about the interest rate so that they can shift the repo rate easily. And the second one, there is the weight, there's some weight on output and some weight on the interest rate. So what we did, we present the generalized impulse responses instead of presenting the regime-specific impulse response function. So this is the IRF following a commodity price shocks. You can see in blue, this is the estimated model. So we can say this is what the central bank is doing. And in yellow and red, this is what it was supposed to do if we were following an optimized policy, okay? In red, it's when the central bank does not care about employment, does not care about the interest rate smoothing, and in yellow, they care a bit more. Okay, you can see that in reaction to the shock, to a commodity price shock, although the domestic inflation falls, okay, it falls more for the estimated model compared to our optimized model. Okay, it's the same picture that we have for the output. Exchange rate, it depreciates or it appreciates less for the optimized model. Labor supply falls less for the optimized model. The current account, not much, okay, just because it's as if the exchange rate is basically playing the role of a shock absorber. A shock on monetary policy, again, we have like some tendency of stabilization of the optimized rule. We see a smaller decrease of domestic inflation when we look at optimized rule. Even on domestic output, exchange rate appreciate less, and the current account also tend to improve less following a monetary shock. So what we see is we saw a large fall, even for the optimized rule, for the shock on commodity, which tells us that it's very difficult for the central bank to basically stabilize after some external shock, while domestic shocks are basically easy to control. So here now we're going to look, we saw that the optimized rule consistently outperformed the estimated model, okay? Stronger control over inflation, because the weights that we have on the policy function are relative to inflation, okay? So we have stronger control over inflation, but whenever we don't look at output, then we have also some more volatility that we're going to see basically when we look at the counterfactual analysis. So here we ask ourselves, what would have been our variable if the central bank follow our optimal policies? And again, we look at the case where there is no weight put on output and interest rate, and some weight put on output and interest rate of 0.5 and 0.3 respectively. So when the central bank does not care about output, they're able to stabilize inflation, okay? Because they don't care about output, we see some fluctuations of domestic output. So the red one is our counterfactual, and the blue is the data, okay? And they don't care about domestic interest rate, some fluctuation as well of the domestic interest rate compared to what we have on the data. And because we didn't add the real exchange rate, we have also the real exchange rate being more volatile than the data. And the current account, not much change. Why? Because again, the exchange rate is playing the role of a shock absorber. Now we look at under the second optimized policy, okay? We care a bit more about output, okay? And inflation, we're still, stabilizing it, okay? The interest rate, still a bit volatile because we are attaching a smaller weight on it, but it's doing much better than the previous one, okay? And the current account as well, not much change because it plays the role of a shock absorber, okay? So what we say is that optimal policy leads to more inflation stabilization, okay? And an interest rate smoothing that is high will prevent monetary policy design, okay? So basically, the policy preference model of emphasizing interest rate smoothing can harm a stabilization effort. Central bank must basically balance inflation control with some flexibility in monetary policy adjustment. So this is the conclusion. So our goal was basically to determine the optimal inflation target, to see basically how the central bank will react to shock. We've seen that whenever we have a strict inflation targeting, we're going to perform well in terms of stabilizing inflation. Output will be more volatile, and then we can entertain a lower inflation target. Whenever we care about output, then it's very difficult to maintain a low inflation target. Then the inflation target has to be a bit higher. Foreign shock, very difficult to stabilize, but we can do better when we follow an optimized rule, okay? And the optimized rules, when we compare them with the data, they tend to outperform historical data, okay? So there's a need for flexibility in inflation targeting, okay? Especially where the central bank needs to be clear in terms of their preferences, because these preferences will impact on the effectiveness of monetary policy. I think that's a conclusion. Some of the other gory details, we remove them. So it's time for questions, and Rutira is there to answer them. I'm joking again. Thank you.